Every morning at 7:30 sharp, in the heart of Trenton, New Jersey's bustling Penn Station, an old man appeared with the reliability of sunrise itself. Wilbur Hammond, 82 years old, and carrying himself with the careful dignity of someone whose body had absorbed more punishment than most people could imagine, would set up his small wooden box beside the main concourse and unfold a hand-painted sign that read, "Boots cleaned free for those who serve." The commuters rushing past rarely noticed him, but the young soldiers passing through on leave or deployment assignments knew to look for the elderly man in the faded baseball cap who'd made it his mission to send them off with properly maintained footwear. Dust's weathered hands moved with practiced efficiency across leather and canvas, his technique refined through decades of military discipline and genuine care for the warriors who followed in his footsteps. Most people assumed he was just another homeless veteran trying to earn spare change through charity, but those who stopped to talk discovered that Hammond asked for nothing except the opportunity to serve those who served others. His small ritual of boot care had become a bridge between his military past and civilian present, a way of honoring the brotherhood that had sustained him through 2 tours as an airborne observer in Vietnam from 1969 to 1971. The wooden box contained brushes, polish, and rags that Dust maintained with the same attention to detail he'd once applied to parachute rigging and reconnaissance equipment. Each morning's setup was performed with military precision, every tool positioned for maximum efficiency, every interaction conducted with the respect that one warrior showed another. If you believe that service takes many forms and that true heroes often work in shadows without recognition or reward, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about the quiet warriors who continue serving long after their uniforms are retired. Don't forget, Dust would tell each young soldier as he finished their boots, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd learned survival lessons in places where mistakes cost lives. On the training ground, clean boots are the first step to staying alive. In life, they're the first step to maintaining dignity. The soldiers usually laughed at his old-fashioned wisdom, but they remembered it later when drill sergeants inspected their gear or when civilian employers evaluated their attention to detail. Dust's boot shining wasn't just maintenance. It was mentorship delivered through practical action rather than lengthy speeches. Tuesday morning brought a group of teenage TikTok influencers to Penn Station, their phones constantly recording as they searched for content that would generate views and engagement from followers who craved entertainment more than substance. They spotted Dust immediately, recognizing an opportunity to create viral content from what they perceived as an amusing anachronism. "Look at this old guy," one teenager said loudly while filming, his voice carrying the mocking tone that social media had normalized among people who mistook cruelty for humor. "He's literally working for free, polishing soldiers like some kind of historical reenactment." His companions laughed and added their own commentary while recording from multiple angles, treating Dust's quiet service as performance art rather than genuine dedication to helping others. "Grandpa's living in the past," another teenager observed, zooming in on Dust's concentrated expression as he worked on a Marine's combat boots. "Probably thinks he's still fighting Vietnam or something." The soldiers receiving Dust's service looked uncomfortable with the teenager's mockery, but none intervened to defend the elderly veteran who was providing them with free assistance. Military training had taught them to avoid civilian confrontations that might reflect poorly on their service or units. Dust continued working without acknowledging the teenager's presence, his movements maintaining the same careful precision despite being recorded and ridiculed. Years of military service had taught him that dignity was maintained through actions rather than responses to provocation. The teenagers posted their content immediately, adding captions designed to maximize engagement through controversy. "Boomer works for tips at train station," and "Vietnam vet still living in war fantasy." The videos spread rapidly through social media networks that rewarded sensational content regardless of its impact on the people being mocked. Within hours, the footage had generated thousands of views and hundreds of comments, most reflecting the casual cruelty that anonymous platforms encouraged. Viewers made jokes about Dust's age, his apparent homelessness, and his dedication to military traditions that seemed irrelevant to people who'd never served their country or anyone beyond themselves. "Pathetic old man with nothing better to do," read one typical comment. "Probably never even saw combat." just wants attention from real soldiers. This is what happens when boomers can't let go of the past, added another. Dude needs to get a real job instead of playing dress-up with army cosplay. But among the mockery, a few comments began appearing from people who recognized something familiar about the elderly bootshiner's face and bearing. Military families and veteran communities maintained informal networks that preserved stories and photographs from previous generations of service members. Wait, wrote a user named Sergeant Mac Returns. That's not just some random old guy. I think that's Wilbur Hammond. My dad served with him in Vietnam. The comment triggered responses from other users who began searching their family photos and military records for references to Dust Hammond's service history. What they discovered transformed the social media narrative from mockery to recognition. A black and white photograph appeared in the comment threads, showing a young paratrooper with Hammond, W. on his name tape, standing beside a crashed helicopter in what appeared to be a jungle clearing. The soldier's face was serious, professional, marked by the 1,000-yard stare that combat veterans recognized immediately. Additional photos followed, Dust in full airborne gear, Dust receiving commendations from officers whose own service records reflected distinguished military careers, and most significantly, Dust carrying wounded soldiers to evacuation helicopters while under enemy fire. Holy shit, commented Vietnam vet son 1971. This is Wilbur Dust Hammond, 173rd Airborne Brigade. He was a forward observer who called in artillery strikes and coordinated medevac operations. My uncle said he saved dozens of American lives during some of the worst fighting in Vietnam. The revelation spread through military social media networks with viral intensity, but this time the energy was directed toward recognition rather than ridicule. Veterans and military families began sharing their own stories about Dust Hammond's service, creating a comprehensive picture of heroism that the original teenagers had completely failed to recognize. Guys, we messed up big time. One of the TikTok creators posted in a follow-up video, his earlier cockiness replaced by obvious discomfort. We were making fun of a legitimate war hero. This dude actually saved people's lives in Vietnam. But the damage to Dust's dignity had already been done, broadcast to millions of viewers who'd been encouraged to laugh at an elderly veteran's attempt to continue serving others through simple, practical assistance. Dust himself remained unaware of his social media fame, continuing his daily routine of arriving at Penn Station early each morning with his wooden box and hand-painted sign. The soldiers he served mentioned the online attention, but Dust dismissed it with the same quiet dignity he'd shown when facing the teenagers' mockery. Don't matter what people say about me, Dust told a young Army private whose boots he was polishing Thursday morning. What matters is you get where you're going with clean gear and clear purpose. But Mr. Hammond, people are calling you a hero online. There are photos of you from Vietnam, stories about lives you saved. Don't you want people to know the truth about your service? Dust looked up from the private's boots, his weathered face showing the accumulated wisdom of 8 decades that included more combat than most people could comprehend. Son, real heroes don't need audiences. They just do what needs doing when it needs doing. All that online noise, that's for people who confuse attention with accomplishment. But 300 miles south in Virginia, at the headquarters of the 12th Aviation Regiment, someone was paying very close attention to the social media storm surrounding Wilbur Dust Hammond. Colonel Helen Phoenix McCarthy, 48 years old and one of the Army's most respected helicopter pilots, had been scrolling through her news feed when she encountered the viral videos mocking the elderly bootshiner. Her initial reaction was the same disgust that most veterans felt when civilians ridiculed military service or those who provided it. But when the follow-up posts revealed the bootshiner's identity, Helen's emotional response shifted to something far more personal and intense. She recognized Wilbur Hammond's face immediately, despite the 50 years that had passed since their last meeting. The young paratrooper who'd risked his life to pull her from a burning helicopter crash in Laos in 1970 had aged into the elderly man being mocked by teenagers who'd never risked anything more dangerous than social media backlash. Helen opened her desk drawer and removed a small metal object that she'd carried for 5 decades, a dog tag stamped with Hammond, W, that had belonged to the soldier who'd saved her life when she was a 22-year-old warrant officer whose helicopter had been shot down during a classified reconnaissance mission. The memory came flooding back with perfect clarity. The crash, the fire, the enemy gunfire, and the calm voice of a paratrooper who'd appeared through the smoke to tell her everything would be okay. He'd carried her 300 yards through hostile territory while she drifted in and out of consciousness, delivering her to an evacuation helicopter that had taken her to medical care and eventually home. "What's your name?" she'd asked as medics loaded her onto the medevac chopper. "Dust. Just call me Dust. I won't forget you, Dust." But she had forgotten, in the way that survivors sometimes push traumatic memories into psychological compartments that allowed them to function normally. Her military career had flourished: pilot training, multiple deployments, steady promotion through ranks that few women had achieved in Army aviation. The scared young warrant officer had become a full colonel commanding hundreds of pilots and aircraft. Now, 50 years later, social media had reminded her of a debt that could never be fully repaid. Helen picked up her secure phone and dialed the operations center. "This is Colonel McCarthy. I need immediate flight authorization for a VIP transport mission to Trenton, New Jersey. Passenger manifest, 1. Destination, Penn Station." "Ma'am, Penn Station doesn't have helicopter landing facilities." "Then we'll make our own landing zone. This is a priority mission." "Yes, ma'am. Estimated flight time 90 minutes. Shall I arrange ground transportation from the nearest military facility?" Helen smiled, remembering Dust's face as he'd pulled her from the burning helicopter, his expression showing no concern for his own safety while enemy rounds impacted around them. "Negative. We're landing at the station. Some deaths require personal delivery." By Friday morning, the social media narrative surrounding Wilbur "Dust" Hammond had completed its transformation from mockery to reverence. Veterans organizations, military history groups, and former soldiers who'd served in Vietnam were sharing detailed accounts of Dust's combat record, creating a comprehensive picture of heroism that stood in stark contrast to the teenager's original portrayal. Sergeant Major Robert Chun, retired after 30 years of service, posted a detailed account that had been shared thousands of times. "I was 19 years old, wounded and trapped in a landing zone that was taking heavy mortar fire. Dust Hammond crawled through incoming rounds to reach me, called in artillery strikes that broke up the enemy attack, then carried me 400 yards to the extraction helicopter. He saved my life and the lives of 6 other soldiers that day in 1970. Similar stories multiplied across military social media networks as veterans and their families shared encounters with the young paratrooper who'd become legendary for his willingness to risk everything to bring wounded soldiers home. Each account added details to a service record that revealed extraordinary courage delivered with characteristic modesty. "My father flew medevac choppers in Vietnam," wrote Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez in a post that included her father's military photographs. "He told me about a forward observer named Dust who would mark landing zones under fire, sometimes staying behind to ensure wounded soldiers were evacuated even when it meant missing his own extraction. Dad said Dust saved more American lives than anyone kept count of." The revelation of Dust's true military background had prompted a response that went far beyond social media recognition. Veterans organizations across the Northeast were coordinating visits to Penn Station, planning to honor the elderly hero who'd been serving others quietly for decades without seeking recognition or reward. But the most significant response was being coordinated 300 miles away at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, where Colonel Helen McCarthy was finalizing preparations for a mission that would settle a debt 50 years in the making. Helen stood in the operations center of the 12th Aviation Regiment, studying weather reports and flight plans while her staff coordinated the logistics for what would officially be logged as a community relations flight, but was actually something far more personal. "Ma'am," Captain David Park approached with final mission briefings. "We've confirmed Penn Station layout and identified potential landing zones. The main concourse has sufficient space for touchdown, but we'll need to coordinate with local authorities for crowd control and airspace clearance." "Negative on official coordination," Helen replied firmly. "This is about personal honor, not military protocol. We land, we complete the mission, we depart. Minimal disruption, maximum impact." Captain Park hesitated, recognizing the tone that indicated his commander was operating from emotional motivation rather than standard military procedure. "Ma'am, unauthorized helicopter landings in urban civilian areas present significant risk." "Captain, 50 years ago, Specialist Hammond risked his life to save mine without authorization or official support. Sometimes the most important missions happen outside normal channels. Helen turned to face her aide, her expression carrying the authority that had made her one of the Army's most respected aviation commanders. I'm not asking you to violate regulations, Captain. I'm informing you that Colonel McCarthy is conducting a personal mission that happens to require military transportation assets. Yes, ma'am. The bird will be ready for departure at 1,400 hours. Helen nodded and returned to studying the photographs that social media users had shared of Dust Hammond's current situation. The elderly veteran sat beside his wooden box every morning, providing free boot-shining services to young soldiers while enduring mockery from civilians who couldn't recognize the value of his quiet dedication. The contrast between Dust's humble present circumstances and his heroic military past exemplified everything that was wrong with how American society treated its veterans. Men and women who'd risked everything in service to their country returned to civilian life, where their sacrifice was forgotten or, worse, ridiculed by people who'd never served anything beyond their own entertainment. Helen's phone buzzed with incoming messages from other veterans who'd seen the social media posts and wanted to coordinate recognition for Dust Hammond. Offers of financial support, invitations to military ceremonies, and requests for speaking engagements at veteran events. All the attention that Dust had never sought, but certainly deserved. But Helen understood that meaningful recognition required more than social media posts or charitable donations. It required someone who understood the true cost of military service to personally acknowledge what Dust Hammond had sacrificed for others. She opened her desk drawer and removed the worn dog tag that she'd carried for 50 years, holding it up to catch the afternoon light streaming through her office window. The metal was tarnished, the lettering faded, but the significance remained as powerful as the day Dust had pressed it into her hand while medics loaded her onto the evacuation helicopter. I won't forget you, Dust, she'd promised while fighting to stay conscious despite her injuries. She hadn't forgotten. She'd just needed social media to remind her that promises made in combat required fulfillment regardless of how much time had passed. At Penn Station, Dust continued his daily routine despite the growing attention from passers-by who recognized him from viral social media posts. Young soldiers approached with mixture of respect and curiosity, having learned about his Vietnam service through online stories that revealed the combat veteran behind the humble bootshiner. Mr. Hammond, a 20-year-old Marine Lance Corporal, said as Dust worked on his dress blues shoes, I read online about what you did in Vietnam, about all the soldiers you saved during those helicopter evacuations. Dust glanced up from his work, his weathered hands maintaining their steady rhythm across the leather. Son, don't believe everything you read on the internet. Most of those stories get better each time somebody tells them. But the photos don't lie, sir. And my grandfather served in Vietnam. He said everyone knew about Dust Hammond, the forward observer who never left anyone behind. Dust finished the Marine's shoes and stepped back to inspect his work with the critical eye that had once evaluated parachute rigging and life support equipment. Satisfied with the results, he began packing his tools while considering his response to recognition that felt simultaneously foreign and familiar. Marine, I did my job like thousands of other soldiers did theirs. The real heroes were the ones who didn't make it home to have their boots shined by old men at train stations. The Marine handed Dust a $20 bill, which the elderly veteran immediately tried to return. Sir, my grandfather said I should never let a Vietnam veteran pay for his own coffee. Least I can do is pay for boot service. Son, I don't do this for money. I do it because clean boots matter, and someone needs to remind young warriors that attention to detail keeps people alive. The Marine pocketed the 20 but left a different form of payment, a formal salute that acknowledged the military rank and respect that Dust had earned through service rather than age. Other soldiers waiting for boot service noticed the salute and followed suit, creating an impromptu honor ceremony in the middle of Penn Station's morning rush. Commuters stopped to observe the unusual sight of young military personnel rendering formal military courtesy to an elderly civilian in worn clothes and a faded baseball cap. Dust accepted the recognition with characteristic grace, returning each salute with the precision that marked someone whose military bearing had never truly retired despite decades of civilian life. Appreciate the respect, Dust told the assembled soldiers, but save your salutes for the officers who still wear the uniform. I'm just a retiree trying to stay useful. But the social media attention was attracting more than respectful soldiers. News crews had begun arriving at Penn Station, having learned about the viral story of the mocked veteran whose true identity had shocked the internet. Local television reporters positioned cameras to capture footage of Dust's morning routine while preparing human interest segments about hidden heroes and the power of social media to correct injustices. Mr. Hammond, Channel 7 reporter Jessica Martinez approached with her camera crew. Can we ask you about your reaction to the social media attention surrounding your military service? Dust continued packing his boot-shining equipment, his movements showing mild irritation with the media intrusion into his quiet routine. Ma'am, I don't have reactions to social media because I don't use social media. I shine boots for soldiers and mind my own business. But don't you think it's important for people to know about your heroic service in Vietnam? The stories being shared online show that you saved countless American lives during some of the war's most dangerous operations. Dust paused in his packing and looked directly at the reporter, his expression carrying the patient firmness that old soldiers used when explaining fundamental principles to civilians who'd never learned them. Miss, real heroes don't need television cameras to validate their service. They just serve. All this attention. It's nice that people want to say thank you, but it's not why I did what I did then or why I do what I do now. What would you say to the young people who initially mocked your boot-shining service before learning about your military background? Dust considered the question while shouldering his wooden box, preparing to leave Penn Station for his small apartment where he could avoid the growing media attention that was transforming his simple service into public spectacle. I'd say they're young and they'll learn. Life teaches everyone about service eventually, either by showing them what it means to sacrifice for others or by showing them what happens when nobody's willing to make that sacrifice. As Dust walked toward the station exit, his movement was tracked by multiple cameras and dozens of smartphones held by commuters who recognized him from viral social media posts. The elderly veteran had become an unwilling celebrity, his humble attempt to serve others transformed into content for people who confused documentation with participation. But 300 miles away, Colonel Helen McCarthy was making final preparations for recognition that would transcend social media attention and television coverage. Her mission required personal courage rather than public performance, acknowledgement of debt rather than entertainment value. The UH-60 Black Hawk helicopter sat on the Fort Belvoir flight line, its rotors and systems checked and ready for the flight that would deliver long overdue recognition to a veteran who'd never asked for anything except the opportunity to continue serving others. Helen walked toward the aircraft carrying only 2 items, her flight gear and the worn dog tag that had connected her to Dust Hammond across 50 years of military service and civilian success. Today, she would finally fulfill the promise she'd made to a young paratrooper who'd risked everything to save her life. The debt would be paid. The promise would be kept. And Wilbur Dust Hammond would learn that sometimes recognition arrives not through social media algorithms, but through the personal courage of those who understand what military service truly costs. As the Black Hawk lifted off from Fort Belvoir, Helen felt the familiar rush of helicopter flight combined with the emotional weight of a mission that had nothing to do with military objectives and everything to do with human honor. In 90 minutes, she would complete the most important flight of her career. Saturday morning found Dust Hammond at his usual position beside Penn Station's main concourse, setting up his wooden box and hand-painted sign despite the media attention that had transformed his quiet service into public spectacle. The news crews from Friday had departed, but smartphone cameras still tracked his movements as commuters recognized the elderly veteran who'd become an unlikely internet celebrity. Dust ignored the attention with practiced military discipline, focusing on the practical task of preparing his equipment for another day of providing free boot service to young soldiers. His weathered hands arranged brushes and polish with the same precision he'd once applied to parachute rigging and reconnaissance gear, muscle memory preserving skills that had kept him and others alive in places where carelessness meant death. The morning proceeded according to its established rhythm until 11:30, when the distant sound of helicopter rotors began penetrating the urban noise of traffic and construction. Most people dismissed the sound as routine military or medical flight activity, but Dust's combat-trained hearing recognized the distinctive signature of a UH-60 Black Hawk approaching from the south. The sound grew louder, more focused, suggesting a flight path that would bring the helicopter directly over Penn Station rather than continuing to conventional landing zones at nearby military installations or hospitals. Dust looked up from the Army private's boots he was polishing, his expression showing the alert awareness that had once warned him of incoming artillery or enemy aircraft. Other people began noticing the helicopter noise, pulling out phones to record what they assumed would be routine overflight of the busy transportation hub. But as the Black Hawk appeared above the surrounding buildings, it became clear that this wasn't a transit flight. The helicopter was maneuvering for landing approach directly onto the station's main plaza. "Holy shit," someone shouted over the increasing rotor noise. "That thing's coming down here." Penn Station's security personnel immediately began evacuation procedures, moving civilians away from the area where the helicopter appeared to be establishing a landing zone. The plaza cleared rapidly as people sought shelter behind concrete barriers and building entrances, leaving Dust alone with his boot-shining equipment in the center of what had become an impromptu helicopter landing pad. The Black Hawk settled onto the concrete with military precision, its rotors creating a whirlwind of dust and debris that reminded Dust of countless combat landings he'd witnessed in Vietnamese jungles and Laotian mountains. The familiar sound and sensation triggered memories that had been dormant for decades, transporting him back to operations where helicopter arrivals meant extraction from hostile territory or delivery of critical supplies. As the rotors spun down to idle, a figure emerged from the helicopter's passenger compartment, a woman in Army flight suit with colonel's insignia, moving with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to command authority. She approached Dust with purposeful strides, her expression showing emotions that transcended military protocol. Dust stood slowly, his joints protesting the sudden movement, but his military bearing automatically asserting itself in response to the approaching officer. Something about her face seemed familiar, though he couldn't immediately place where he might have encountered her during his service decades earlier. "Wilbur Hammond," she said, stopping 3 feet away and removing her flight helmet to reveal graying hair and eyes that carried the accumulated wisdom of decades in military aviation. "Do you remember me?" Dust studied her face carefully, searching through 50 years of memories for recognition that felt just beyond reach. The voice triggered something, a tone, an inflection that connected to moments of extreme stress and life-threatening danger. "I remember eyes," Dust replied slowly, his own voice carrying uncertainty mixed with growing recognition. "You were hurt. Scared. Kept saying don't let go, don't let go." Colonel Helen McCarthy smiled, tears beginning to flow down cheeks that had been weathered by decades of military service in environments where women had to prove themselves every day. "I was Warrant Officer Helen Parker then. 22 years old, first tour in Vietnam, flying reconnaissance missions that officially never happened." The recognition hit Dust like physical impact, memories flooding back with perfect clarity. The helicopter crash in Laos, the burning aircraft, the young female pilot trapped in wreckage while enemy forces closed on their position. His desperate effort to extract her from twisted metal and flames. The 300-yard carry through hostile territory while she drifted in and out of consciousness. "Phoenix," Dust whispered, using the call sign he'd heard on her radio during the extraction. "You made it. You survived." "I more than survived, Dust. I thrived. 30 years of military service, command of aviation units, hundreds of successful missions. All because you refused to leave me behind in that crash site." Helen reached into her flight suit and withdrew a small metal object that she'd carried for 5 decades. Dust's dog tag, worn smooth by years of handling and marked with his name and service number. "You gave me this when the medics were loading me onto the evacuation helicopter. You said I should remember that someone cared enough to risk everything to save my life." Dust accepted the dog tag with trembling hands, his weathered fingers recognizing the familiar weight and texture of metal that had once been part of his identity. The simple piece of stamped aluminum connected him to the young paratrooper he'd been, the missions he'd completed, and the lives he'd managed to save during 2 tours of combat operations. "I told you I wouldn't forget," Helen continued, her voice carrying the emotional weight of promises kept across decades of separation. It just took social media to remind me that some debts can't be paid through career success or personal achievement. They require personal acknowledgement. The plaza around them had filled with spectators drawn by the unusual sight of a military helicopter landing at a civilian transportation hub. Smartphones recorded from every angle as the crowd realized they were witnessing something far more significant than routine military exercise or emergency response. News crews that had covered Dust's story throughout the week repositioned cameras to capture the reunion between the elderly bootshiner and the colonel who'd traveled 300 miles to honor his sacrifice. Local television reporters provided live commentary for audiences who were witnessing real-time resolution of a human interest story that had captured national attention. Colonel McCarthy, Channel 7's Jessica Martinez called out, "Can you tell us about your connection to Mr. Hammond?" Helen turned toward the cameras, her military bearing automatically asserting itself in response to media attention. But instead of providing standard military public affairs responses, she chose to share personal truth that transcended official protocols. 50 years ago, Specialist Hammond saved my life when my helicopter was shot down during a classified mission in Laos. He risked his own life to pull me from burning wreckage, carried me through hostile territory while under enemy fire, and ensured that I made it to medical evacuation. She paused, looking back at Dust, who stood quietly beside his boot-shining equipment while processing the emotional reunion that had transformed his morning routine into public celebration. Without his courage and dedication, I would have died at 22 years old in a jungle clearing that doesn't appear on any official maps. Instead, I had the opportunity to serve 30 years in military aviation, command thousands of soldiers, and contribute to missions that protected American lives around the world. Helen's voice strengthened as she addressed the crowd that had gathered to witness the reunion. But more importantly, Specialist Hammond demonstrated the values that define military service: loyalty, selflessness, and commitment to bringing everyone home. Those values didn't end when he retired from active duty. They continued through his daily service to young soldiers who passed through this station. She gestured toward Dust's wooden box and hand-painted sign. While civilians mocked him for providing free boot service, veterans recognized what he was really doing: maintaining the traditions that connect generations of military service, ensuring that young warriors understand the importance of discipline and attention to detail. The crowd's response was immediate and emotional. Veterans who'd gathered throughout the week to support Dust began applauding, their recognition spreading to civilian spectators who finally understood the significance of what they'd witnessed. But the most meaningful response came from the young soldiers who'd been receiving Dust's boot service throughout the week. They formed an impromptu honor guard around the elderly veteran, their presence acknowledging the mentorship and care he'd provided without recognition or reward. "Mr. Hammond," Marine Lance Corporal Johnson stepped forward, speaking for the assembled soldiers, "we want you to know that your service, both in Vietnam and here at the station, hasn't gone unnoticed. You've been teaching us about honor and dedication through your actions rather than your words." Dust looked around at the faces surrounding him: young soldiers whose boots he'd polished, veterans who'd traveled to support him, civilians who'd learned to recognize his value, and the colonel who'd never forgotten his sacrifice. "Appreciate all the attention," Dust said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden stillness that had fallen over the plaza. "But I want you to understand something. I didn't save Phoenix because I expected recognition 50 years later. I saved her because that's what soldiers do. We take care of each other." He held up the dog tag that Helen had returned to him. "This little piece of metal doesn't make me special. Every person who's worn the uniform has earned the right to carry one. What makes us special is what we do with the opportunity to serve others." Dust turned toward his boot-shining equipment, then back to the crowd. "I shine boots because clean boots matter. They matter for discipline, for confidence, for the kind of attention to detail that keeps people alive in dangerous places. But mostly, they matter because they remind young soldiers that someone cares about their success." The applause that followed was sustained and heartfelt, but Dust deflected attention from himself by asking the crowd to recognize all veterans present and the active duty soldiers who continued serving around the world. As the formal recognition concluded, Helen approached Dust for private conversation while her helicopter crew prepared for return flight to Fort Belvoir. "Dust, I have an offer for you," Helen said, pulling out an official-looking document. "The Army wants to honor your service with ceremonies, medals, and formal recognition. You've earned every decoration we can award." Dust studied the paperwork, recognizing the kind of bureaucratic attention that he'd avoided for decades. "Phoenix, I appreciate the gesture, but I'm not looking for parades or politicians making speeches about my service. I'm happy doing what I'm doing." Helen smiled, having expected his response. "I thought you might say that. So I have an alternative proposal." She produced a second document. Authorization to establish a permanent memorial at Penn Station honoring veterans who continued serving their communities after military retirement. The Wilbur Dust Hammond Veteran Service Memorial. A place where young soldiers can learn about the values that connect military service across generations, where veterans can gather to support each other, and where civilians can understand what sacrifice looks like. Dust read the authorization carefully, noting that the memorial would include educational components about military history and veteran services rather than simply celebrating his individual achievements. "This isn't about me," Dust observed. "No, it's about what you represent. Service that continues beyond retirement, mentorship that connects generations, and dedication that doesn't require recognition to maintain its value." Dust nodded slowly, understanding that meaningful recognition could serve purposes larger than personal gratification. "I'll accept, but with conditions. The memorial includes all veterans, not just me. And I keep shining boots here every morning until I can't anymore." "Agreed." "And Dust, thank you for saving my life, for serving others, and for reminding us what military values look like in practice." As Helen's helicopter lifted off from Penn Station, carrying her back to Fort Belvoir and continued military service, Dust returned to his wooden box and began preparing for the next young soldier who might need boot service. The memorial would be built, ceremonies would be held, and recognition would be provided. But the most important work would continue as it always had, one soldier at a time, one pair of boots at a time, one act of service at a time. Some heroes, Dust had learned, didn't need helicopters to make their most important flights. They just needed the opportunity to serve others and the wisdom to understand that recognition was less important than the work itself. 6 months later, the Wilbur Dust Hammond Veteran Service Memorial opened at Penn Station, featuring educational displays about military service, resources for veteran support, and a small area where Dust continued his daily boot-shining service. A bronze plaque near his usual position read, "Some serve in uniform, some serve in civilian clothes. All serve with honor when they put others before themselves." But Dust's favorite addition was simpler, a wooden bench where young soldiers could sit while their boots were cleaned, allowing for conversations about service, sacrifice, and the values that connected military generations across time and distance. The work continued, as it always had, with quiet dignity and practical purpose that needed no explanation beyond the satisfaction of helping others succeed.